The morning Caleb Harding turned 43, he did what he did every morning. He woke before the sun, pulled on his worn jeans and flannel shirt, and walked out onto the porch of the ranch house to watch the darkness bleed away from the Montana sky. The coffee in his hand was black and strong, same as it had been for 15 years, same as everything on the Harding spread had been for 15 years. Unchanged, unmoved, like a photograph someone had taken of a life and simply left on the wall to yellow at the edges. The ranch itself was beautiful in the way that lonely things sometimes are. 200 acres of grassland that rolled toward the Beartooth foothills, a modest herd of Angus cattle, a small apple orchard his mother had planted 30 years ago that still bore fruit every September as if out of sheer stubbornness. There was a red barn that needed a new coat of paint, a bunkhouse where nobody slept anymore, and the main house with its 4 bedrooms, 3 of which had their doors perpetually closed. Caleb lived in the 4th, which he shared with a blue heeler named Scout, and approximately 15 years of accumulated silence. He was not an unhappy man, or at least he had told himself that for so long it had taken on the texture of truth. He was simply a man who had learned to need very little. He bought his groceries in Lanton, the nearest town, every 2 weeks. He attended church on the first Sunday of each month, not out of deep devotion, but because it was one of the few times he allowed himself to sit in a room full of people and feel, for a little while, that he was part of something. He nodded to his neighbors when he passed them on the road. He was polite to everyone and intimate with no one. The last woman who had been in his life in any real way was Sarah. He did not think about Sarah very often, not because the memory was unbearably painful, though it had been, once, but because he had simply placed that part of his life in one of those closed rooms and shut the door with a quiet finality. Sarah had left the spring after they buried their son, a boy who had lived only 11 days, and Caleb had not blamed her. He had understood. Grief is a country with room for only one, sometimes, and Sarah had needed to leave. She had gone to her sisters in Portland, and then, eventually, to a life that Caleb knew nothing about. He wished her well in the abstract, honest way that people wish well to strangers. He had dated once, briefly, in the years following the divorce. A schoolteacher named Donna, who laughed too brightly and touched his arm too often, and deserved far more than a man who couldn't remember how to be present in a room with someone else. He had ended it after 6 weeks with an awkward conversation in a parking lot, and she had cried a little and told him she hoped he'd find what he was looking for, and he had thanked her and driven home and fed his cattle and not thought about it again until right now, standing on the porch at 43 with cold coffee and a dog pressed against his leg. It was Scout who first heard the truck coming up the road. The dog lifted his head from where it rested on the top of Caleb's boot and looked toward the long gravel drive that connected the ranch to the county road. His ears went up, and he made a sound that wasn't quite a bark, more of a soft, uncertain rumble. Caleb looked up too. It was just past 6 in the morning. Nobody came to the Harding place at 6 in the morning. Nobody came to the Harding place at any time if they could help it. The truck was an old red Ford, and it made a sound like a man clearing his throat repeatedly and never quite succeeding. It pulled up to the front of the house and stopped, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the door opened and a woman got out. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, Caleb guessed, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a braid that had mostly escaped whatever had been holding it, so that loose strands framed her face in a way that looked less like style and more like surrender. She was wearing a blue dress that was too thin for the September mountain chill, and she had a large canvas bag over one shoulder and a look on her face that was the particular expression of someone who has just realized they are in the wrong place, but hasn't yet decided what to do about that. She looked at the house. She looked at the porch. She looked at Caleb. "Is this the Harmon place?" she asked. Her voice carried across the yard clearly, with a slight southern inflection that didn't belong in Montana but sounded, somehow, like it had been traveling a long time to get here. Caleb set his coffee mug on the porch rail. "It's the Harding place," he said. She closed her eyes briefly, and something moved across her face, not quite panic, but the close cousin of it. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the sky for a moment, as if it owed her an explanation, and then she looked back at him. "Harmon," she said. "Dale Harmon, on Trout Creek Road." "Trout Creek Road is about 12 miles north of here," Caleb said. "You'd have turned left at the junction, not right." She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, and it was a short, tired sound, not entirely humorless. "Of course," she said, more to herself than to him. She put her hand to her forehead and stood there in the middle of his yard in her thin dress, and Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was the vague and uncomfortable pull of concern for another person's immediate well-being. "You want some coffee," he said, because it was the only thing he could think to say. She looked at him as if weighing the offer carefully. "I don't want to put you out," she said. "You're not," he said, which was true. Nothing put him out any more. He had long since arranged his life so that very little could. She came up onto the porch, and he held the screen door open for her, and Scout pressed against her legs immediately, tail going in that frantic helicopter way that meant the dog had decided within 2 seconds that this person was trustworthy and good. Caleb had learned over the years to take Scout's assessments seriously, for what they were worth. Her name, she told him, once they were inside and she was wrapped around a mug of coffee at the kitchen table, was Nora Vasquez. She had driven up from Billings the previous night, had taken a wrong turn somewhere in the dark, and found herself on a road with no signage that eventually turned to dirt and ended at a fence. At which point she had pulled over and slept in the truck for a few hours because she didn't trust herself to drive any more. She was originally from Georgia, had been in Montana for 3 weeks, and she had answered an advertisement. Caleb, sitting across the table from her with his own fresh coffee, did not ask what kind of advertisement. It was not his business. But she told him anyway, in the matter of fact way of someone who has decided that the situation has already gone sideways enough that there's no point in pretending to dignity. "A personal advertisement," she said. "A rancher in need of a companion, Dale Harmon. We exchanged letters for 4 months." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I know how that sounds. It doesn't sound like anything," Caleb said, which was true for him, even if it wasn't true in general. She looked at him with a mild skepticism that suggested she had grown accustomed to people's opinions showing up on their faces before they could stop them. "I'm 40 miles off course," she said, "and I've been sleeping in a truck. I passed judgment on myself about 3 hours ago." There was something in the way she said it, the dry, clear-eyed humor of it, that made something in Caleb's chest move slightly, the way a door moves when someone walks past it in a hallway and disturbs the air. He looked down at his coffee. "Have you eaten?" he said. "Not since yesterday afternoon." He stood up and went to the refrigerator. He made eggs and toast and sliced some of the cheddar he kept in a block, and found a jar of his neighbor Ruth's apple butter in the back of the cabinet. And he set it all in front of her without ceremony, and she ate with the focused gratitude of someone who had stopped trying to be polite about hunger. He sat with her and had a second cup of coffee, and Scout lay under the table with his chin on Nora's foot, which the dog had never done with anyone in Caleb's memory. "You have a beautiful spread," she said, once she had eaten. She was looking out the kitchen window at the land going gold in the early light. "How long have you been here?" "Born here," he said. "Took it over from my father when he passed. 20 years ago now. On your own." He paused for just a moment. "On my own," he said. She nodded, not pushing. He appreciated that. Most people, when they detected the outline of a story, leaned forward. She leaned back, looking out the window, and let the land do the talking. After a while she said, "I should call Dale. Let him know I'm coming. He'll be worried." She pulled out her phone and frowned at it. No signal. "You won't get one out here." Caleb said, "You can use the landline." He gestured to the old wall phone near the door, the one he kept mostly because he had never gotten around to removing it. She called, and Caleb went out to tend the cattle and give her privacy. He could hear her voice through the screen door as he crossed the yard, low and clear, and then a laugh, surprised and warm, and he found himself walking a little more slowly than usual through the morning air. When he came back in, she was standing at the kitchen window with the phone cord stretched across the room and her canvas bag on the counter, and she was looking at his refrigerator, which was held shut with a single magnet in the shape of a trout that had been there since before he could remember. "He's fine," she said, hanging up the phone. "He was worried, but he's fine. He says take the county road north to the junction at the water tower." She turned around. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "It wasn't any inconvenience," Caleb said, and this time he meant it more specifically than he had before. She picked up her bag, and Caleb walked her out to her truck, and Scout followed them both, pressing against her legs one more time at the driver's door. She bent down and scratched the dog's ears with both hands, and Scout went still with pleasure. "He doesn't do that with anyone," Caleb said before he could stop himself. She looked up at him. In the morning light her eyes were brown with something golden underneath, like creek water in late afternoon. "He's a good judge," she said, and there was something in it that was a question as much as a statement. "He is," Caleb said. She stood up and opened the truck door. Then she stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for the coffee and the eggs and the apple butter, and just for being a person about it, when you could have been otherwise. Anyone would have done the same," Caleb said. She looked at him with a calm frankness that made him feel, briefly, seen in a way that was not entirely comfortable. "No," she said, simply, "they wouldn't." Then she got in the truck, and the engine turned over on the third try with its chronic clearing, throat sound, and she pulled out of the yard and down the gravel drive and turned onto the county road and went north. Caleb stood where he was for a while. Scout sat beside him, and they both watched the dust settle back onto the road. He went inside and washed the dishes. He told himself, for the rest of the day, that he was not thinking about her. He was not thinking about the way she had looked out his kitchen window at the land going gold. He was not thinking about the particular quality of her laugh on the phone. He was not thinking about the fact that she had come here, however accidentally, from Georgia, which was a very long way to come for the possibility of a life, even if the life she'd been aiming for was 12 miles north of his. He fed the cattle. He repaired a section of fence near the eastern boundary. He ate dinner standing at the counter. He went to bed. For the first time in a very long time, he did not fall asleep easily. A week passed. October arrived, and the aspens turned along the creek bottom, and the mornings got serious about being cold. Caleb drove into Lanton for groceries and stopped at the post office and at the hardware store for fence staples. And at the diner he ran into his neighbor Pete Aldrich, who asked him if he'd heard about the woman out at the Harmon place. What about her? Caleb said carefully. Pete shrugged into his coffee. "Dale Harmon's a peculiar man, not a bad one, but peculiar." He paused. "Word is things aren't going well. She's staying in town some nights at the Ridgeline Motel. Carol, who cleans up over there, says the woman seems real nice, but real confused about what she walked into." Caleb said nothing and drove home. He did not drive past the Ridgeline Motel. He was not that man, and he knew it. He went home and split firewood for 2 hours and stacked it against the side of the house. And when he was done, his arms ached and his mind was quieter, which was the purpose of the exercise. She showed up on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the first time. He was in the barn when Scout started up, and this time the bark was happy, recognizing, and Caleb put down the harness he'd been mending and walked to the barn door, and there she was, coming across the yard in jeans and a proper coat this time and boots that were worn at the heel in a way that suggested they'd done real work. "I was on my way back through," she said when she got close enough, "and I took the same wrong turn." He looked at her. "There's a sign at the junction now," he said. "Put it up myself." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that acknowledges it has been caught. "There is," she said. "I saw it." He let the silence sit for a moment, and then he said, "Come in and have coffee." And that was that. She sat at his kitchen table again, and Scout lay on her feet, and this time she looked around at the house, really looked. The way you look at a place when you're considering it rather than just passing through. She looked at the row of books on the shelf above the fireplace, the mix of ranch manuals and history, and one worn paperback of Steinbeck that had been read so many times the spine was white. She looked at the framed photograph on the wall of Caleb's parents on horseback somewhere in the high meadow, taken sometime in the 1980s and faded to honey tones. She looked at the closed doors down the hall. "How are things at the Harmon place?" Caleb said. "I left this morning," she said. She said it simply, without drama, looking at her coffee mug. "Dale is a good man, but we were strangers on paper, and we are strangers in person, and I think we both knew within the first 2 days that the letters they were their own thing. They didn't translate." She paused. He was relieved too, I think, just too polite to say it first. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "Don't be. It was a gamble and I knew it." She looked out the window. "I just thought." She stopped. Started again. "I was living in Atlanta and I had a job I was good at, and an apartment that was fine and everything was fine, and I just thought, if one more person asks me if I'm seeing anyone and I have to say no, and watch their face arrange itself into that expression." She made the face, briefly and perfectly, the slightly tilted head, the soft, sympathetic eyes, the small, pursed concern. Caleb recognized the expression. He had received it many times himself, in church fellowship halls and feed store parking lots, from people who meant well and didn't know that their sympathy landed like a light accusation. "So I took a left turn," she said, literally, it seems, and in every other sense. He looked at her for a moment. "What are you going to do now?" "Drive back to Billings," she said. "Fly home." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "Figure out what comes after that." They sat in a silence that was, strangely, not uncomfortable. Outside the window, the October light was low and gold, and the aspens along the creek were dropping their leaves in the wind, each one catching the light as it fell. "My wife left 15 years ago," Caleb said, and he didn't entirely know he was going to say it until he had. "We had a son who didn't survive. She needed to go. I understood it." He paused. "I let the rooms go quiet, and I got good at the quiet, and I told myself that was enough." Nora looked at him. She did not say she was sorry, which he appreciated. She just listened. "I think the truth is I was afraid," he said, "that if I let anyone in again, the loss would." He looked at his hands on the table. "You work a piece of land long enough and you learn that the ground can take anything. Drought, frost, flood. The land is still there. People are not like that." "No," she said softly. "They're not. But maybe that's not the right way to think about it," he said, and this was a thought he was having in real time, out loud, which was not something he did. Maybe the right way is that the ground takes the drought and the frost and the flood, and it is changed by them, and it's still there, and things still grow from it. Nora looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "That's a pretty good thought," she said. "I've had a lot of time to come up with it." She laughed, and this time it was not the short, tired laugh from the first morning. This one had room in it. She stayed for lunch. He made sandwiches, and they ate at the kitchen table, and he told her about the ranch, the cattle, the orchard, the way the high meadow looked in June when the wildflowers came up so thick you couldn't walk through them waist deep. She told him about her job, project management for a construction firm, and about her family in Savannah, her mother who grew gardenias on the back porch with a devotion bordering on religious, her brother who played guitar in a band that had been about to get big for approximately 10 years. She talked the way some people do when they've been quiet too long. Not too much, not in a rush, just finding the words again like picking up a skill that had been set aside. In the afternoon she walked the property with him and Scout, out to the eastern fence and along the creek bottom where the aspens had dropped half their gold into the water, and the creek ran through a skin of yellow leaves. She did not pretend to know things about ranching she didn't know. She asked real questions, and he gave real answers, and the conversation moved between them easily, the way good conversation does, like water finding its own level. When the light began to drop, she said she should get on the road. "It's a long drive to Billings," Caleb said, "and the pass gets dark fast." "I'll be fine," she said. They stood by her truck and Scout leaned against her shins, and the evening air came down from the mountains cold and clean. "Thank you," Nora said, "for both times. Come back a third," Caleb said, and his voice was quiet and even, but she heard it exactly as he meant it. He could tell by the way she looked at him. "That's a long way to come," she said, "from Georgia." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment, her head slightly tilted, her expression open and thoughtful in the way he'd noticed it was when she was being most honest. "What would I be coming back to?" she asked, not coy, just clear. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think the not knowing might be the point." She nodded slowly. She reached out, and her hand touched his forearm just briefly, through the flannel of his shirt, and even through the fabric he felt it like something waking up in him that he had long ago decided was simply gone. She got in the truck, and the engine started on the second try this time, and she drove down the gravel drive and turned right onto the county road, headed south toward Billings. Caleb stood on the porch in the dark for a while. Scout sat beside him. The mountains were black shapes against a sky that was still faintly blue at the very top, and the first stars were coming up, and the air smelled of cold grass and coming winter and the faint apple scent from the orchard where a few last fruits were still hanging on. He went inside. He opened the door to one of the closed rooms, turned on the light, and stood looking at it for a long time. It was dusty and still. There was a dresser with nothing on it, and a window that looked north toward the mountains, and the last of the evening light was on the glass. It was not a sad room. It was just a room that had been waiting, the way rooms do when you let them. He left the door open. He wrote her a letter the next morning, because it seemed like the right form. He had her email from the one note she'd sent to confirm her route, but an email felt like the wrong weight for what he wanted to say. He found paper in a drawer he hadn't opened in years, and a pen that still worked, and he sat at the kitchen table with coffee and thought for a while before he started. He did not write a romantic letter. He was not sure he remembered how, and he was not sure that was what the moment required. He wrote a practical and honest letter, the way he tried to be practical and honest about everything, and in it he said that he was not a complicated man, but he was not a simple one either, and that the ranch was real, and the work was real, and the loneliness had been real too, and he was done pretending it wasn't. He said that he wasn't asking her to do anything specific or to make any decisions. He was just saying that the door was open. in whatever sense she wanted to take that, and that if she ever found herself taking a wrong turn in Montana again, he would consider it a right one. He mailed it in Lanton and didn't tell anyone, and didn't think about it more than 40 or 50 times over the next 2 weeks. Her reply came by email, because she said she didn't have stationery, and that felt like something she should fix. It was a good email. It was warm and real, written the same way she talked, finding the words naturally and not performing anything. She said she'd thought about the ranch a lot since she got home. She said she'd thought about the aspen leaves in the creek and the apple butter and the dog who'd slept on her feet and the man on the porch with his coffee who could have been any kind of person and had turned out to be a particular and rare kind. She said she was coming back, not for Dale Harmon, not for any arrangement or advertisement or predetermined idea, just to come back and see what the not knowing might turn into. She arrived on a Saturday in November when the first snow had come down from the high country and dusted the tops of the Beartooths white. Caleb heard her truck. He could recognize the sound of it now, that persistent throat, clearing engine, and he walked out onto the porch with his coffee, and Scout was already down the steps and across the yard before Nora had gotten the door fully open. She came out of the truck laughing, because Scout had his paws on her knees and was greeting her with the full force of his affection, and she was wearing a heavy coat this time and proper gloves, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked up from the dog and saw Caleb on the porch, and she raised one hand, and he raised one hand, and that was its own kind of conversation. She stayed the weekend. She slept in the room with the good north window, and the dresser he'd wiped clean, and the light he'd replaced. She cooked dinner on Saturday night, a recipe her mother had taught her, slow, cooked and fragrant, and they ate together at the kitchen table while the snow fell lightly outside and Scout slept between their chairs. They talked for a long time after, the way people talk when they are learning the dimensions of each other and finding them, so far, navigable. On Sunday morning she walked the orchard with him in the snow. The last apples had fallen, and the bare branches were laced with white. He told her about his mother planting the trees, how she'd insisted on them even when his father said the soil was wrong, how the first year they'd produced only 6 apples, and she had made a pie from them anyway and declared victory. She sounds formidable, Nora said. She was the strongest person I ever knew, he said. She stayed right to the end. He paused, looking at the bare trees. My father couldn't have done any of it without her. I used to think that was a weakness in him. Now I think it was just honesty. Nora looked at him. Snow was collecting gently on her shoulders and in her hair. I'm not here to save anything, she said. Or to be saved. I want you to know that. I know that, he said. I'm just here because I took a wrong turn and found something I didn't expect, and I think it deserves time, she said. Careful, slow time. I've got nothing but time, he said. This is a ranch in Montana. She laughed again, the full one, the one with room in it, and her breath made a small cloud in the cold air. And Scout bounded through the snow between the apple trees like an animal half his age. And the mountains stood white and enormous above the valley. And Caleb felt something he had not felt in so long that it took him a moment to identify it. It was not happiness, exactly, or not only that. It was the feeling of a door that has been shut for a very long time standing open, and cold air and light coming through, and the room no longer being empty but full of the particular aliveness of a space in which something is about to begin. They walked back to the house through the snow, and Caleb held the door and she went in, and Scout followed at her heels, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the land that was white and still and full of the seeds of spring underneath. The way land always is if you know it well enough to believe in what you cannot yet see. Then he went inside and let the door fall shut behind him, and the kitchen was warm, and coffee was on, and the sound of her voice came from the next room, talking to the dog in that easy, unhurried way she had, and for the first time in a very long time the house did not sound quiet. It sounded, simply and astonishingly, like a home